Ayan na. Kamusta kayo dyan, mga kameta? Happy Independence Day! Kamusta naman kayo dyan? Ayan. Ito na guys, mukhang mag-episode 510 na yata tayo guys. And this is really something. Hoy D, ikaw mukhang ano, episode ano na lang tayo guys, episode 510 or something like that. So wow, we have come very very far. Thanks to you, thanks to your support dito sa ating podcast, Deep Dive, otherwise known as Meta, kaya ka-Meta mga tawag natin sa inyo. Mga kasama natin dito. Of course, I hope you're having a special day with your family, loved ones, and you're making the most out of this very, very well, in a secular sense, a sacred day dito sa kasaysayan ng Pilipinas. Pag-usapan natin itong Happy Independence Day kasi paano naman natin hindi mapag-usapan ng Happy Independence Day? Guys, ito na, pagkita ko sa Facebook, pagkita ko sa Twitter, labasan na yung mga may t-shirt na West Philippine Sea. Naglabasan ng mga tao, lahat ng may mga pictures na may flag of the Philippines. Naglabasan na lahat ng mga ano, di ba? May ginawang anything na may kinalaman dito sa West Philippine Sea, sa laban natin laban sa China essentially, di ba? Among other things. So, interesting. Talagang nagdagsaan na. And I was wondering, guys, I don't know kung updated kayo, but at baka naman si Bato rin nilabas rin niya yung mga ano West Philippine Sea shirt niya. I mean sa aking palagay sa lahat ng mga West Philippine shirt, siguro ito yung pinaka tight fitting West Philippine Sea shirt na nakita ko. Kung sinong mga designer dito kay Kuya, mga designer ni Bato de la Rosa, tsaka itong mga napaka napaka patriotic natin, mga senators, especially itong isang dito, di ba? Itong tinatawag na bato-bato, di ba? Kamusta naman sa mga yan, di ba? So, hindi ko alam kung itong taon na to ay naglabas siya ng mga ganitong t-shirt or ano lang, disposable la ba yan or one time, big time la ba yan. But as you know guys, ito yung, you know, I'm all 100% for people um, showing solidarity. I'm 100% for people reminding everyone pagdating sa kanilang mga feelings dito sa West Philippine Sea. I am 100% for everyone buying any, you know, any any product or any any kind of sign of showing na may pakita sa ating bansa. But what I'm concerned about is yung performative or ritualistic expression of dedication sa ating bansa. Ritualistic or performative in the case of some politicos. Because these are the same politicos that you wonder nasaan sila, 'di ba? Nasaan sila pag binubuli ang Pilipinas ng big time? Nasaan sila? Hindi yung sa Independence Day, hindi pagkalaban natin ng China, tinatambakan natin sila sa FIBA World Cup, hindi ganoon. Nasaan ang mga taong ito panahon na kailangan talaga natin sila para labanan ng mga pagbubuli sa ating bansa. Kaya kanina nag-post tayo about, I mean, obviously, of course, it's a happy day. Um, it's always good to be reminded that we don't live in a colony anymore. It's always good to be reminded na, we have come a long way since yung panahon nila Rizal when they were colonial subjects. Wala silang karapatan. They were not even considered as full human beings. I mean, go and study yung legal case ni Luna, for instance. How his lawyers argued, in favor of, him getting not getting the maximal punishment for his quote unquote crime of passion. Look at essentially how we were portrayed, diba? In European and Western imagination as colonial people. Tayo ng mga hindi Caucasian, tayo ng mga colonial subjects. Even yung mga Espanyol na dugo na pinanganak sa Pilipinas or mga colonies, hindi sila tinitrato ng buong tao. And this is what I was say, ang problema natin is minsan, yung tingin natin sa kasaysayan is extremely not only narrow, pero sobrang distorted. Kasi pag tinignan mo yung mainstream uh, understanding of Philippine history is parang yung panahon ng mga Espanyol, purong mali nangyari, purong pag-aapi. And then pagdating sa mga Amerikano, everything was okay. And then itong mga lang yung mga pasyista na Hapon na sumugod sa atin ng World War II at masama na, pero thanks to America, silang nag-save sa atin, I shall retain all of that. When in fact, if you look at it, very interestingly, it was during the Spanish period, towards the late 19th century especially, na there was enough prosperity, there was enough education standard, in fact, the highest in Southeast Asia. We had the highest literacy rate in Southeast Asia. We had the oldest universities in Asia, University of Santo Tomas, and what would later on become some of the oldest and most prestigious universities in the world, like Ateneo, for instance. All of these were Spanish era, and the kind of people like Rizal wouldn't have been able to afford education in Europe at the highest levels, wouldn't have had the chance to be exposed to the highest level of education when it comes to being literate in Latin, in Greek, and of course Spanish and European language. All these foundations were built back in the Philippines, and you had the kinds of Isabella de los Reyes who never studied abroad, right? And yet, he was competent in handling sources and scholarly works from across the world, and then making sense out of that para intindihin yung ating kasaysayan, especially kasaysayan ng mga Ilocano, di ba? Among others. So, and Mabini, for instance, another homebred, like hindi nag-aaral abroad, pero napakagaling na abogado, and Aguinaldo, for instance, who barely even got out of his own province and still had tremendous amount of military skills, or General Luna, for instance, no. In the case of course General Luna, he studied abroad, so you could also see these are people. So a problem is that parang panahon ng Espanyol, lahat yan mali. And then parang tingin natin, pagdating sa Amerikano, parang lahat okay. When in fact, if you really look at it, nung panahon ng mga Amerikano talaga nagkaroon ng deterioration sa ating bansa on so many levels. First of all, they stole our independence because we were winning against Spain. Talong-talo ng Espanya. Pangalawa, kung titignan mo, after pumasok ang mga Amerikano, we didn't produce ilustrados anymore. Yes, we produced people who got scholarships and studied in the United States. Yes, we produce, for instance, people. We produce all sorts of people, for instance, who would be great writers, for instance, or specialists, doctors, professionals. But we never really created again yung katulad ng mga ilustrados. People who could converse in four, five, six languages, right? People who could write in three, four languages at least. Like Rizal, for instance, he has letters written in German, French, Espanol, obviously, and to a certain degree, even English. He was becoming competent in that language. So that incredible cohort of people that they were able to rise nung mga panahon ng Espanyol, hindi na nangyari sa panahon ng Amerikana. Hindi ko sinasabi na maganda lahat ng nangyari sa panahon ng Espanyol, but I think when you look at that, you will also appreciate the fact na yung panahon ng Amerikano, there was also a deterioration in overall reeling of the most educated and elite in our country. Although, of course, I think the Americans did a decent job in terms of producing, for instance, a semblance of universal education, right? They introduced some sort of democracy, but very oligarchic democracy, because the landed elite could benefit from that. But what I'm saying is, it's not about saying Spain is better than U.S. It's just saying Spain had its own problems, and then there were also some little things that happened during the time of the Spanish, some good things also. And during the time of the Americans, they were not our knight in shining armor. So as Carlos Celdran and among other Filipino nationalists would have emphasized, isang dahilan na hindi na ganun kaganda ang Manila kumpara dun sa pre-World War period is para dahil binomba-bomba ito ng mga Amerikano. So if you don't believe me, for instance, look at this fantastic work by this American historian. This was Pulitzer nominee. This Rampage Battle, ukol dun sa Battle of Manila, di ba? Na sinira-sira ng mga Amerikano, di ba? So this is the book by James Scott. Hindi ito, hindi ito Chinese or wala. Itong book, Rampage, James Scott. So kung basahin nyo ito ng mabuti, guys, in fact, all you need to read is just even the summary of that. Yung mga Amerikano, para hindi mamatay yung kanilang sundalo dahil ang dami mga Hapon sa Manila and all out suicidal kamikaze, binomba-bomba na lang nila yung buong Manila. Right? Kaya sobrang sira-sira ng Manila. And thousands of Filipino civilians died. Carpet bombing ginawa nila, di ba? So, and then, after bombing the Philippines and pulverizing the Philippines, anong ginawa ng mga Amerikano? Ayan, sige, maging independent na kayo. So, binigyan tayo ng independence natin after totally destroying Manila. Now, obviously, it was the fault of the Japanese na things turned out so bad. But let's also not forget that, eto mga Amerikano yung drop ng lahat ng mga bomba na yan. Now, having said that, some of us have been. I mean, I've been to places like Berlin, for instance, which was also one of the most devastated cities on earth. I've been to Hiroshima, for instance, which was, America dropped a nuclear bomb there. That's true. But at the same time, guys, so they were able to recover. So napakagandang Berlin ngayon, napakagandang Hiroshima ngayon. But let's still not forget, guys, ito yung ginawa ng mga bomba ng mga Amerikano sa atin. All right? This is the result of the bombing of the Americans. Tignan mo. All right? Now, if you look at your news today, you would see some places on earth, unfortunately, kind of look like this. Right? And you also wonder, saan ginawa ng mga bomba na yan? Now, again, this is, guys, just to be clear, this is not to say na lahat ng mali nangyari sa mundo ay dahil sa mga kano. That's not true, of course. And I know that ginagamit ito ng mga pro-China elements, mga ganon, para to distract us, no? Para ma-distract tayo dun sa mga ginagawa nilang kalokohan sa West Philippine Sea. But, it is very important for us to understand yung circumstances ng ating national independence. Alright? I had something else in mind, but for some reason, this is my fourth speech today. So, umaga pa lang, nagbibigay tayo ng talks. I had meetings with people at the foreign ministry, different offices dito sa New Zealand, Wellington, and I had a 1 hour talks at Radio New Zealand. Another hour talk engagement naman dun sa Asian New Zealand Foundation. So, medyo sabaw na tayo, to be honest. And I was trying to finish an article and said, there's just no way. But I said, I have to do this. I mean, there's no way that we'll have a National Independence Day and not have any meta. I said, and no matter how exhausted I am, it's 12 p.m. right now, so it's midnight, and I have to wake up early morning for my next talk tomorrow. But, I just felt, this is a day, where we have to remind ourselves of yung mga circumstances ng ating national independence. We were supposed to be independent already by 1898, if not for Americans stealing. And I find it even weird na ginagamit natin yung lingwahe ng mga Amerikano, but let's put it that way. Let's use American language to expose yung kanilang totoong kasaysayan sa Pilipinas. And I'll tell you another thing, mga kameta. You know what's very interesting dito sa New Zealand? So even before meetings natin, even with senior officials, even on the record, off the record, parati sila nagsisimula with Maori, essentially, almost prayers, right? And they start greeting people in the Maori language and all of that. And so this is the little way by which, essentially, New Zealand is trying to make recompense, no? Dun sa kanilang brutal na kasaysayan laban sa mga Maori indigenous groups. In Canada, in Australia even, of course, the minority situation is arguably even worse than here in New Zealand, but there are certain efforts to recognize that. What I found always interesting is I've barely heard any American official openly mentioning the Philippines as a former colony, right? When in fact we were a colony. And to remind you again, they gave us our independence after doing this to the Philippines. All right. Again, I really suggest you guys go and read Rampage by this great American author, written in really gripping ways, so that you have an idea about the circumstances of that. So they gave us independence right after we were left as a completely devastated country. And sometimes I wonder, and this is where things are sad, and the argument that a lot of scholars would make, and I think Lelo is also making this, and there was a New York Times piece about this that I can forward to you guys, is, ang problema sa atin is, okay, binomba mo, okay, first, yung ating revolution was stolen from us, hinijack ng mga Amerikano when we were defeating the Spanish. We can have a lot of conversation on what could have happened afterwards. Yes, Nick Joaquin is right to say na malay mo, we're not sure if, we could have held on to the entire Philippines. Maybe the Dutch will get Palawan, English will move on. Okay, we can have those conversations, no? But nevertheless, I mean, it's Dutch getting Mindanao, British getting Palawan. Yes, we can have it, or Germans coming in. Sure, we can have those conversations. Pero what's undeniable is that pagdating sa ating independence, right, we were getting our independence on our own terms until hinijack ito. And very relevant sa akin, guys, itong nangyari sa 1898 is because Aguinaldo, yung pag-iisip niya ay katulad ni Digong. All right? Um, Aguinaldo was so angry at Spain na hindi na nakita yung katotohanan pagdating dun sa new rising power. And I think it's the same thing with Duterte in the sense that, well, there's a big difference between Duterte and Aguinaldo. Duterte fought for Philippine independence. Well, I'm sorry, Aguinaldo fought for Philippine independence. Duterte, well, I don't know. Mr. Province of China, I don't know about that. But in the case of Duterte, the similarity with Aguinaldo is that sa sobrang galit siya sa Amerika, hindi niya nakikita yung ginagawa ng China sa atin. But nevertheless, we shouldn't forget saan galing itong independence natin. The independence should have come to us as early as 1898. And then we had to wait, what, another almost 50 years, right? 48 years or whatever. Um, and again, the circumstance of that sinirasira nila yung ating bansa, both the Japanese, of course, primarily I blame the Japanese for that, but we shouldn't also forget the fact now who dropped the big bombs that destroyed Manila. And we can have a conversation about kailangan ba talaga na bobombahin ng Manila ng big time ng ganyan in order to defeat the Japanese. So we have to have these serious conversations about this, mga kameta. But going back to this, the other big mistake is that both the Spanish and the Americans, essentially ang ginawa nila is they never pushed for fundamental reforms that would empower the rising middle classes in the Philippines and the majority population. The same political dynasties, the same principales, the same political dynasties, the same trapos and oligarchies, right? From the Spanish era, some of them go all the way back to Spanish era, but some of them also would rise during the American era. Ang hindi ginawa ng dalawang powers na yan, di ba? They say it, if you break it, you own it. They colonized the Philippines, so they are responsible also for what would go wrong in the Philippines in the immediate aftermath of our independence. So on one hand, we got our independence not on a civil platter, but on the ruins of the Pearl of the Orient. Let's not forget that. And always research who dropped those massive bombs that made Manila like that. As much as we have to recognize that primary fault is, of course, with Imperial Japan for their brutal occupation and invasion of the Philippines. Those two things can coexist as facts. We don't have to choose between them. And obviously, Imperial Japan was the evil in Second World War. No question about that. And I'm glad that Japan is no longer there. Okay, sure. Again, but going back to this, yung isa sa mga pinakamalaking problema is the same oligarchies would keep on cutting deals and will be able to have their cake whoever was the superpower colonizer in the Philippines. And that's the big problem because never itong mga oligarchs na to were pressured to engage in land reform, pressured to engage in building strong manufacturing sector, and then post independence Philippines essentially would have these parity rights which would allow Americans to essentially own land in the Philippines and businesses in the Philippines and have access to the Philippines as if we are still kind of their colony. So I can go on and on about this. So I think it's very important for us to understand that unfortunately the circumstances that we got our independence were far from ideal, both economically but also geopolitically. But most importantly, I would say psychologically. Kaya napakamahalaga sa atin in an era where declining power ng US, in an era where threat ang China, right? In an era where Japan is no longer the imperial Japanese threat that it used to be. In this era, it's very, very important, guys, that we try to find our own place in the world, right? And you cannot find your own place in the world. You cannot rise as a major power, or as in the case of the Philippines, as a middle power in this world, guys, if you do not properly understand what on earth is your real history. What on earth is your real history? So I think it's very important na parati natin babalikan yung panahon nila Rizal to get an inspiration, to remind ourselves of how much we were at the forefront of nationalism and independence in the Philippines, and anti-colonial movement and independence movement in Asia. But we also have to remember the tragic circumstances under which we got our formal independence, on the towards the end of Second World War, after Manila and our essentially the heart of the Philippines was completely devastated by massive bombing, right? And that caused huge economic damage, but also lives of so many Filipinos, among other things, and that we were not also given the right conditions to prosper on our own after we got our formal independence. Kaya the 21st century, because unfortunately the 20th century was a century of new empires and powers. The late 19th century was also the century of high noon. It was a high noon of colonial powers. But the 21st century, hopefully, will be a century whereby, guys, we finally figure out what on earth do we want for our own country. And I think, as I said, there is a massive power transition here. US is declining relatively, China is rising, but at the same time, all of us are also growing economically. So Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, we're among the fastest growing countries in the world. We have huge populations. We have Our population is almost as big as Mexico, right? So we're not a small country anymore. So I think it's very important for us. I have nothing against this David versus Goliath mindset, but it's extremely important, guys. Now we don't look at ourselves always as small country, as underdog lang, as if kawawa lang tayo. No, no, no. Hindi dapat tayo paawa effect or kawawa effect. Dapat hindi. Dapat ang tingin natin sa atin is like David. Palaban, malakas, may laban. Di ba? Hindi lang palaban, may laban dapat, meaning may mga kakayahan ka. So it's very important we have that kind of psychological reorientation in the Philippines and push back against both pro-American camp, but even strongly against the anti-China. I'm sorry, the pro-China camp, right? Uh, and so this is what that I think we have to keep in mind pagdating sa atin dito sa Independence Day natin. Now, going back to this also, guys, I think it's extremely important that we have these kinds of discussions. We have this kind of discussion. Kasi we don't have to choose right? We can have alliances, but that doesn't mean you completely choose one side over the other. Kaya nga hedging is something that I always discuss dito sa across my talks around the world. I say there are 50 shades of hedging. There are so many different ways of hedging. Now, let me also say that one of the things that makes me always proud as a Filipino is how diverse we are. But more importantly, how tolerant we are, how cosmopolitan we are, 'di ba? So kung titignan mo, may kinalaman din ito sa ating kultura, may kinalaman din ito sa ating kasaysayan because yung mga pinakaunang quote-unquote Pilipino, marami dyan sa kanila ay may dugong na Espanyol, essentially white man, essentially Europeo. And then later on, yung konsepto ng pagiging Pilipino ay nag-evolve. So this began to involve yung mga mestizo, Chinese mestizo, Filipino mestizos, and the likes of Rizal, the likes of Luna, and the likes of Andres Bonifacio, and Jacinto, and Mabini. So to begin with, napaka-diverse, right? Diverse, racially diverse, culturally diverse, no? Ang ating mga founding fathers and founding mothers, Gabriela Silang, for instance, right? Padre Borgus, for instance, a lot of these people were mestizos, or so it was never a racial thing. It was always about being born and raised on the Filipino soil. It's about that emotional attachment. It's about fighting for the Philippines, including maraming Creoles at mga Pilipino lumaban sa mga Chinese na pirates. Lima Hong, for instance. Or yung mga Pilipino lumaban-laban sa Briton because Britain occupied the Philippines for more than 2 years during the 7 Years' War in the 18th century, right? So that's how we built that unique identity as Filipinos, and this was always cosmopolitan. Okay, I also very much hope na these West Philippines disputes does not undermine the cosmopolitan fabric of the Filipino nation, right? We have to very much distinguish, right, between the bad, aggressive, bullying policies of the Communist Party of China, on one hand, and then ordinary Chinese people, right? Again, we may have some issues with people from other countries with different cultural and educational upbringing, sure. Pero dapat i-separate natin mga dalawang yan. Because unfortunately, the ordinary Chinese people have no say in their foreign policy. China is not a democracy by any stretch of imagination. Their leaders are not elected by people in free or at least competitive elections, right? So it's not a democracy. And even more importantly, we have to make a distinction between our Filipino Chinese or Chinoy brothers and sisters on one hand, and then people from mainland China and the Chinese government. So there are degrees of separation here. So one of the things that really worries me dito sa Pilipinas is we get into this kind of racialist, if not sometimes racist, commentaries when we talk about patriotism. That is not patriotism. Because patriotism has nothing to do dun sa kung anong family name mo, kung anong kulay ng balat mo, or it doesn't have to do anything about that. Patriotism means you just do your basic duty as a citizen for your country. Among others, right, means, guys, that you do not argue things in favor of the country that bullies you. So I'm 100%, guys, in favor of um, academic and open debate. I am an academic myself. I come from UP. I teach at UP. So I completely welcome discussions. I do that in my classroom. I have that with my colleagues and other people. I have nothing wrong with you criticizing the Philippine government. I do criticize the Philippine government too. I have been doing that across administration. And then I also give credit where I think credit is due. But I always said our Independence Day will be happy if we get some of the basic things right. Right? Figure out ano ba talagang kasaysayan natin? Ano ba talagang identidad natin? Anong gagawin natin? Anong kailangan natin gawin sa kasalukuyan na panahon in the 21st century? Kailangan din natin pag-usapan dito ay ano po yung floor? Ano bang mga minimal na expected from a patriotic Filipino? Because if you go to Vietnam, not so democratic country, but very patriotic country, or you even go, let's say, to uh, I don't know, Germany or any self-respecting country. I mean, okay, fine. Let's just talk about our neighboring countries. You go to Singapore, you go to Vietnam, whatever. You go to Taiwan, for instance. You know, in those countries, if you come out there and openly argue in favor of China's position against your own country, there are going to be consequences, right? And I'm not justifying those consequences necessarily because as a Democrat, of course, I welcome freedom of expression. Pero may minimal acceptability. In fact, in Taiwan, interestingly, Chinese din sila, although politically separate from China. Even in China, the pro-China people in the Kuomintang party, for instance, if you look at the last elections, pinalitan nila yung tono nila dahil natanggap nila yung katotohanan, which is vast majority of Taiwanese people consider themselves as Taiwanese, not Chinese. It used to be Taiwanese and Chinese, but they consider themselves as Taiwanese. So even yung mga parang pro-China version nila ay nire-recalibrate yung kanilang positioning. So there's that floor even in Taiwan, right? Look at their elections this year versus their elections 4 years ago, right? When yung opposition leader was almost Duterte-like, former mayor of Kaohsiung, right? And later on was, I think was kicked out of power for abuse of power, and there were also suspicions na tinutulungan siya ng mga troll armies among others from China. And then you go to Vietnam and Singapore, you openly argue in favor of China against your own national interest, or the interest of Vietnam in the case in Hanoi, or the interest of Singapore, and you're going to be in trouble. There will be consequences, right? So these are three countries with very different political regimes, whereby there is some basic floor. And unfortunately, yun ang hindi natin nakikita sa Pilipinas in the past few years. You have all the right to criticize again the policies of Marcos if you think this is not good for the Philippine national interest. But when you openly make fun of Filipino Coast Guard, Philippine Navy getting injured, pinagtatawanan mo yan, minamak mo yan, ay mukhang may problema tayo dito. Hindi ito academic debate, hindi ito democratic debate, hindi ito tactical debate. Iba na yan, right? Try doing that. Try going to Vietnam and then pagtawanan mo yung mga Vietnamese na fisherman or Vietnamese na mga Coast Guard, pag ini-injure or pinapatay sila ng mga Chino, tingnan natin ang mangyari sa'yo. Diba? Or gawin mo yan sa Singapore, go to Singapore, openly say something against China, in favor of China against Singapore, and let's see what will happen to you, right? Or even Taiwan. Good luck, diba? So, this is something else. This is something else. Kaya sabi ko, gawin natin mas happy pa Independence Day, right? I mean, there was an earlier version of my post when I said, I hope we rid our country of, traitors and all. And I said, like, I kind of sounds wrong, baka misinterpret yan. I mean, I didn't mean it in a dictatorial way, of course, Democrat. But, what I'm saying here is, we need, guys, this is very, very important. We need to have that floor, whereby anything below that, dapat we question, dapat tatanungin talaga, ano ba, saan ba talaga yung sorry about that. Saan ba talagang loyalty mo? Right? Kasi mukhang wala kang even the minimum. So this is the challenge for us in the Philippines. We have to set the minimum. And unfortunately, this is the reality. So long as may mga tao na katulad Digong sa ating bansa, parating may lakas ng loob yung mga iba dyan to essentially argue the case for China against the Philippines. There are going to be people there who will feel empowered, guys, to attack the Philippine Coast Guard, to attack the Philippine Navy, to attack our own people, attack anyone who cares about West Philippine Sea, attack any country that provides us help, and then essentially apologize for China, make excuses for China. This should not happen in any self-respecting nation, regardless of political regime, democratic or not. And that's the floor that we have to set, right? As we try to achieve, you know, genuine, right, hard-won independence. I think itong laban natin sa West Philippines is really our way forward towards genuinely fighting for our independence. And kaya ang mahalaga na hindi rin tayo masyadong dependent sa mga Amerikano and that we work with a network of allies, with New Zealand, with India, with South Korea. Look at our best weapons. They're not coming from the US. Our best weapons are coming from India and South Korea. And if the submarine deal pushes through, our best weapons could be coming from France, for instance, right? Again, not United States, right? Or not even Japan. So it's very important, guys. We have some basic things, you know, clear to us. Sobrang mahalaga yan, guys. All right? Sobrang mahalaga yan. So, as I want, hopefully, dun sa susunod na Independence Day natin next year in 2025, we don't have elected leaders na openly, right, lumalaban para sa karapatan ng ibang bansa na binubuli tayo. Alright? So, napakamahalaga, guys, sa darating na election talaga, we send a strong signal. Ang gusto natin dito ay Team Pilipinas, hindi Team China. That is extremely, extremely important, guys. And we have to also make it clear na hindi ubra sa atin yung susot ka ng West Philippines t-shirt at pakit-pakit ka dyan sa FIBA World Cup. And then pagdating sa kailangan ng suporta, kailangan magpakita ng basic decency and basic patriotism, biglang tahimik ka, mema ka, no comment ka. 'Di ba? Hindi pwede yan. Hindi talaga pwede yan. So, I think a proper understanding for a nation means we accept horrible things that our colonizers did, whether it's Spain or United States. But at the same time, we should not allow that to blind us to what's happening today. Kaya maganda rin yung sinabi ni ni Mark. Sabi niya, yeah, pwede natin pag-usapan yung mga panahon ng Espanya, pero patay na lahat mga yan. Pag-usapan natin yung mga pinapatay ngayon or muntik na patay ngayon. Yung mga kababayan natin dyan sa West Philippines and mga other things. So, I think these are the things that we really have to keep in mind. And this is the floor that we have to have pagdating sa ating national independence. And as I said, I'm 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 always proud of how cosmopolitan and how tolerant and democratic we are in the Philippines. So as much as we want to fight against bullying policies of the Communist Party of China, we should also make sure that we don't descend into this kind of cycle of xenophobia, of ethnocentrism, or racist attacks and all of that. It's not easy, but this is what we have to do, guys. This is what we have to do. On that note, thank you very much, mga kapatid. Nakita na medyo napagod na tayo. Usually, I mean, obvious naman sa itsura natin. And, that's the sign na pagod ako, actually. Thank you so much, guys. Again, dun sa lahat ng mga sumuporta sa atin throughout the years, sa Spotify, sa podcast, please continue to support us. Deep Dive with Richard Hidarian. Libre lang mag-rating. Please, hopefully, God willing, you think we're good enough. And spreading the word and asking more people to watch us. Looking forward to more discussions, lectures here, and then God willing also to more talks and lectures, likely inshallah in Europe also soon, as the UNCLOS arbitration award anniversary, was it eighth or ninth anniversary? Ninth anniversary, yes, gets closer. So marami tayong kailangan gawin, marami tayong kailangan pag-usapan. Pero mahalaga din talaga yung inyong suporta sa atin, right? Without your support, I'll be honest, there are many times I was super tired at talagang sabi ko, ay gusto ko lang matulog. But I just felt it's very important that we have this regular dialogue, especially on the National Independence Day. This is very, very important, mga kameta. So maraming salamat sa inyong support. I really, really appreciate it. As I said, 4 hours ahead tayo, so sobrang late na dito. Go pa rin tayo. Doon sa ibang bansa, 15 hours behind tayo, 12 hours behind tayo, 11 hours. So I think we have had these metas more or less around the same time across practically almost all time zones. So thank you so much, guys, for continue supporting us, because yun po ang nagbibigay ng lakas ng loob sa atin. And I hope in my own little ways, I'm also inspiring some critical thinking and compassionate understanding of what's needed in the Philippines. The last point I want to also make here is I always say we have to stop thinking of ourselves as a small country, a small power, because we are a middle rising power. But at the same time, we also have to fight against a culture of mediocrity. I think this is really, really alarming sa Pilipinas. So as I was saying kanina, pagpansin nyo, since sila Rizal, we haven't had any people like that in the Philippines. And when I talk about since sila Rizal, because Rizal was not the only great guy there. There was Isabela de los Reyes, there was Tavera, there was Luna, brothers, all of them. I mean, this is a bunch of like Renaissance man. And for me, isa sa mga dahilan rin na hindi tayo nagkaroon ng ganitong mga batch of ilustrados of their caliber, essentially in the past century or so, with of course exceptional cases of Nick Joaquin among others, you know, I can talk about some very great writers, but you see, what we had during the time of mga ilustrado was not just a good writer. What was not just a good sculptor. Uh, you know, Juan Luna was not just a great painter. He designed he designed yung uniform ng ating mga revolutionary forces. This is a guy who could write beautiful letters, right? Rizal was not just a great novelist. He was a great political thinker. He was a great doctor and ophthalmologist. Isabel de los Reyes was a great journalist. Was involved in religious politics and theological discussions. Was engaged in anthropology. Is more or less known as the father of anthropology. Was the founder of labor union movements essentially in the Philippines. Right. He was the senator who pushed for the Philippines to fight. So one reason we're not having those people, and I'm sorry if I'm getting a little bit frustrated about this, is because no, no, I'll spell it out. One of the things I'm really proud about is that um, I grew up intellectually, I would say, among really exceptional peers, right? And you are familiar with some of them. Leloy Cloudy, for instance, right? These are exceptional peers I have had. And he's just one of many, many very smart people, right? I can name other names, but I'm not sure if they're comfortable if I, you know, and it's really sad because and by the way, si Patricia Evangelista was our senior in the debate world also, in debate society and all of that. But more or less, we're all the same age. Medyo matatandang millennials. Millennials pa rin. When I look around, they're practically all outside the Philippines. They're practically all outside the Philippines. Um, Although in the case of Patricia, of course, I'm glad she's back in the Philippines, but she was driven out of the Philippines because of all of the threats and all against her for exposing yung war and drugs. So I think one reason why we also have is because we no longer have this kind of Spanish era colonialism or anything like that, but there's just this horrible culture of mediocrity in the Philippines, which is just driving away really our best and brightest. I'm sure Berkeley's I'm sure Berkeley's lucky to have someone like Leloy. I'm sure universities in Australia are lucky to have someone else also in their peers. I'm sure that you know hospitals in London or research centers are good. I mean, there are many people I can name. I don't know if they're comfortable. I mention them, but at the top of my head, there are like 10 really brilliant Filipinos, including some of my peers who was the youngest ever doctor. In the film at 21 years old, palang natapos siya ng medicine and naging doctor and all. I mean, they're all abroad. They're all abroad, and of course they're abroad for many reasons. I'm sure there's their personal reasons. I'm sure but I know there are a lot of them also were essentially driven out of the country, driven out of the country by people who are intimidated by their talent and genius, people who hated them for their talent and genius, people who didn't perhaps appreciated them for their independence and thought and conviction. So na-driven out itong mga marami to. And konti na lang kami mga natira sa Pilipinas. I mean, of course, yeah, I go all around the world and give talks, but Manila is still my home. I still teach in the Philippines. I write for Philippine Daily Inquirer. I worked with One News TV5. So it's it's really depressing. It's really depressing when you think about it. But at the same time, I just hope, similar to what I see in other countries like Vietnam, if we fix our country, if we fight back against that culture of mediocrity, right? And by the way, the culture of mediocrity is happening in supposedly elite institutions, right? A lot of my friends who have been essentially decided to go abroad, they used to teach or they used to work in supposedly elite universities. But what happened? Politics in here, pinopolitika dito, pinopolitika dyan, and they were driven out, essentially. Well, because they're so good and so smart, they ended up in the best institutions on earth, right? That's how good these people are. But they were driven out of the country. And I know they love the Philippines because they write on the Philippines, they follow up on the Philippines, they are kametas in certain way on watching us. So sorry, Lele, I could only mention you. I felt I'm comfortable enough to mention you, but there are other people I can also mention. So fighting for national independence is also fighting against mediocrity and fighting for greatness. And I'll tell you what, among my greatest naysayers ever, many people who try to bring me down are unfortunate people that I expected better from. All right, people that I expected who would know what I bring to the table. And it really saddens me when I see it's people all around the world at the highest levels who seem to see the potential that people like me have, or more than a potential. It's like what I bring to the table. And thanks to you guys, honestly, I have been able to just shove aside, diba? All of that shoddiness and nonsense and culture of mediocrity. And I'm also very thankful, to my family in One News, my family in Philippine Daily Inquirer, my family in UP, for supporting me and standing with me. But I just hope we create conditions whereby, and I'm talking about the top universities, top media institutions, so that we bring back the best and the brightest, while we also rear a new generation of best and brightest. Sana kasi ang politika sa atin, hindi lang yung mga politika nila Bato and Duterte. Meron din tayong politika sa mga kung saan-saan sa Pilipinas. Patronage politics is almost everywhere. In my case, I was just lucky enough because I had mentors who encouraged me to be best of myself in my early 20s. So, early 20s pa lang, nagsusulat na ako ng sarili kong libro na internationally published, di ba? Mid 20s, late 20s na lang. I'm already starting to write for New York Times and Foreign Affairs and all of that. But I know my case was exceptional, almost in every sense of the word. Not because I am exceptional necessarily, but it's because I was lucky to have certain people who supported me through and through. So I really hope, maybe I'm just being emotional, I'm just tired, it's a long day, but I really hope we get rid of this mediocre people and culture of mediocrity, because this is holding our country back and driving away who could have been the Ilustrados of the 21st century. Of the 21st century. It just really, really saddens me. And some people will say, what are you doing, Richard? You have already succeeded. You're already here. You're already there. Yeah, okay, in my case, because I was lucky enough to have all of these institutions all around the world to see me for who I am and for what I offer, right? They're not blinded by jealousy and nonsense and mediocrity, right? And I was lucky that I have people like you, who have been supporting me through and through, right? And that has allowed me to just, like, sino ba sila, diba? But not everyone has those things, and not everyone that has my kapal of mukha. I mean, I think one reason why I'm very aggressive also, and people, I don't think you need to be close to me to know I have quite an aggressive personality. It's because I realize you shouldn't give room to mediocre people to hold you back, and you shouldn't allow them to drive you away, right? And I completely respect the decision of some of my peers and colleagues who I see as ilustrados for now being abroad, and I hope one day they'll come back. But I feel in my own little ways, I'm trying to contribute to bringing some true, genuine culture of excellence, so that all of these people will come back one day. Not because of me, obviously, but because of bigger forces, right? So independence will come if you're self-respecting, if you're respectable, right? True independence comes when you get your act together. true independence comes when you're moving upwards, not only in material capability, but also in terms of your heart, your soul, your intellectual ambitions, no? Moral ambitions. So, this is the other problem we have in the Philippines. This very serious culture of mediocrity and this kind of pathetic unearned elitism, from people who are far from world class, and then they're super elitist and look down at the rest of the people. Like who, you're nobody on a world stage, and you're acting as if you're super genius and all, and look down at people who didn't have the luxury or privilege of being educated in best universities. And we talk about, and people do voter blaming and all of this elitist nonsense without looking in the mirror and looking at how much mediocrity is holding back us as a nation. Ang pagiging matalino or pagiging magaling ay hindi lang sa pag-Ingles-Ingles lang. Alright? Or nag-graduate ka lang ng ganitong eskwela. Each good university produces hundreds of thousands of students every now and then. Alright? So you're just one of those. What truly makes you great is what our illustrados were doing. Producing high quality materials, art, sciences, under the most difficult conditions. And this is where I have really high respect for Rizal. I mean, Rizal came back to the Philippines when his life was in danger. Now, well, during Duterte, that was the case. That's why great ones like Patricia Evangelista for a while had to perhaps get out of the country because they were exposed. But there are also a lot of people I know that were just driven out because, voila, they're not being allowed to grow by people who are jealous of them. People who don't even have self-awareness to know this is professional jealousy, and this is and I cannot also actually blame those people. It's just the culture of mediocrity. So this is the other thing that we have to fight back against, right? Mediocrity is holding us back. Mediocrity is not allowing us to think outside the box. Mediocrity is not allowing us to really be ready to adopt the gold standard from best practices from around the world. Mediocrity is based on nothing but stereotypes and preconceptions and elitism and pang-English lang, wala naman laman, salita ng salita, wala naman na publish, di ba? Yabang ng yabang, wala naman na, di ba? So, yep. So when I talk about independence, I'm looking at the whole picture, 360 degrees. In the meantime, and let's end on a good positive note, I'm glad na mukhang natuwa yung mga ibang kababayan natin dito sa Wellington na nakita natin kanina. Shout out naman dyan, of course, dun sa ating mga kababayan natin sa Philippine Embassy, National Independence Day, of course. Um, in my own little way, I'm just going around the world and saying, do not look past the Philippines. Do not underestimate the Philippines. Against all odds, horrible politicians, bad governance, culture of mediocrity, because of the sacrifices of ordinary people, of our OFWs, of our overtaxed middle class, of our marginalized and oppressed masses. We have made so much sacrifices throughout this time for the Philippines to become a force to reckon with. Not a superpower, but a good enough rising power so that we're taken seriously. So when I go around the world, it's not I'm saying I'm going out because I'm Richard Haydarian. Well, partly, of course, it's because of what I do, but it's also because I'm speaking about the rise of the Philippines in spite of all of these problems and all of that. So, ang dami kong sinabi about yung mga kakulangan sa ating bansa, but I still do believe that it is worth to talk about the upward movement of our country because it's through inspiration that you really can overcome the biggest challenges. And it's cynicism, it's skepticism, it's mediocrity. Those are the things that will hold us back and prevent us from going to the next level. On that note, thank you very much. Maraming salamat. Mabuhay po kayo. Mabuhay ang Pilipinas. Mabuhay kayong lahat ng mga sumusuporta sa atin. I know many of you may not agree with everything I say. Well, problema nyo na yan kung di nyo ma-appreciate yung sinasabi natin. I know marami sa inyo ay baka naiinis pa sa atin or hindi natuwa dun sa mga ibang sinabi natin or baka na-hurt kayo. Pasensya na lang, but if I'm saying the truth, then I'm not sorry. And I always say the truth as much as I can, as much as I can as a human being with all my imperfections and all. And thank you so much for supporting us despite the fact that, you may not agree with me and all of that. But I hope at least if there's one thing that you see, guys, is that dedication eh. Madali magbigay ng vlog once in a while na inspired ka and all of that. But we're vlogging every night almost, guys. Of course, with the exception of Sabbath day, among others. But every night, whatever time zone, we would do this. And one of the things that constantly inspires me is because I also get inspiration from you guys, right? Maybe it's just a number of comments here and there. Sometimes even constructive criticism. I understand. I understand. I appreciate. I appreciate that as long as it's constructive and hindi lang ad hominem and all of that. So please continue to do what you're doing because I hope we're all part of a little movement here to push our country beyond the culture of mediocrity and hopefully even inspire our voters to vote out those who cannot even meet the floor, the bare minimum for any self-respecting Filipino, right? They don't even meet the bare minimum in terms of patriotism and love for the nation. On that note, thank you very much. God bless. Talk to you soon.